So I'm delighted to introduce Achint, who is a certified information privacy professional, CIPP. And through his job, he advises some of the world's largest corporations on their privacy and their security. So please welcome to the stage Achint Sehgal, who is GDPR and privacy management at OneTrust.
All right. Good morning, everyone, or almost good afternoon. Well, my name is Achint Sehgal, part of the OneTrust team. Like we said, I work with some of the largest and most complex organizations from around the world for GDPR implementation best practices. And what we are going to be doing today is talking about a couple of these operational things inside of GDPR. So consent is this hot new topic. So what does consent really mean inside of GDPR? And where do you need consent? Do you need consent? And more importantly, what are the places where you do not need consent from people and the data subjects? And then also a sneak peek into, in practice, how would you implement these operational requirements that GDPR is bringing up for data controllers? So how do you tackle the operational stuff that needs to be tackled by organizations from around the world? So there's lots to consider. And let's first start with setting the stage, like what is consent? So if we look inside of GDPR, consent is a real thing. It's not a concept. It's not this kind of ambiguous thing. It's a real legal instrument inside of GDPR. In fact, we saw in a previous presentation, you saw there are 6 legal bases of processing data. Consent is one of those 6 legal bases. And I would argue that it's probably the most kind of unpopular kind of consent that organizations want to rely on. And we'll see in a little bit why that's the case, what are the nuances that are associated with it. The point is, you've got other legal bases. Consent only comes into play when you're relying on consent as your legal basis of processing data for your data subjects. Now, let's also bring up something that gets confused really, really fast, right, with consent. So in GDPR, there are 2 articles, Article 13 and Article 14, that talk about the right to be informed. So you have to inform people about certain aspects. And this Article 12 in GDPR tells you how you should do that. It says you've got to do things in a concise manner. They have to be transparent. It has to be intelligible. It has to be clear language. It has to be plain language. And then a myriad of things that you need to tell the data subject about. So it gets confusing really, really fast. Now, just because you're getting consent from somebody, or just because rather you're telling people what you're collecting on them, and you're giving them this information that Article 13 asks you to give to them, does not mean that you have their consent. 2 separate things. Right to be informed, very separate than what consent is. Consent is a legal instrument. There are specific requirements for how to implement consent. There is guidance on what is expected when you capture consent from people. So it can get confusing really fast if you mix up these 2 things around informing people and capturing consent from them. So that's something that needs to be thought through very appropriately. Before you start throwing around the word consent, you should know what exactly that means to your business, what it means to your privacy obligations, and what it means to your data subjects when you give them consent options. So let's look at how GDPR actually defines consent. What is the wording there? So it says in Article 4 in GDPR, any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes, by which he or she, by a statement or by a clear affirmative action, signifies agreement to the processing of personal data relating to him or her. Those words are very, very precise. Each word in these sentences carries some kind of weight. It carries some kind of specific meaning. GDPR has put it very, very intentionally, not like a loose description of success or unambiguous kind of description of these requirements. So very specific, and that's why when you look at how would you even think of getting consent, you need to account for what does consent even mean inside of the GDPR context. So given that we have defined what consent is, let's now also think of freely given, specific, informed, unambiguous, and all of these conditions for consent to be valid. What does valid mean? It means that if you do not meet these conditions, even if you got consent, it becomes kind of illegal to have that consent, or that consent is actually not valid and may not be appropriate in producing like a defensible argument should you be audited for those things. So you want to consider what consent is and what are the conditions that make that consent actually valid. So let's do a quick sneak peek. What does freely given mean? So freely given is there should not be conditions attached to giving consent, right? So let's say, the data subject should have the ability to be able to refuse consent. If I put my business card into a prize drawing and I have to consent that you'll email me, is that freely given? Anyone? No, it's not, right? You're putting a condition that you'll email me and you're asking me to consent on that. So it's not freely given consent. Right? And you also have to think about the specific nature of consent. What's the purpose for which you are capturing consent? Purpose has to be clearly defined when it comes to capturing consent. So I go to a website and I say, I want to sign up for a free trial. So you take my information and you use that information for your sales rep to also email me with stuff. Is that specific purpose for which I gave my consent when I signed up for the free trial? It's not. I gave you my information so that I can sign up for a free trial. I never consented to somebody emailing me about other things. So it has to be very specific. It has to be tied to a purpose. It has to be freely given by the data subject without any conditions. And also, it has to be informed. Now, this word informed is what makes it really confusing with the right to be informed. Two separate things. Informed here is consent is way above just the right to be informed. So in right to be informed, in Article 13 and 14 that we brought up a couple of minutes back, there are certain things that you have to give to people regardless of the legal basis that you use. All of the 6 legal bases makes right to be informed valid. So it doesn't matter which of the 6 legal bases you used, whether it was the legitimate interest, whether it was contractual, like contract requirements, whether you were complying with a legal obligation, or whether you were relying on consent. You have to comply with the right to be informed. This informed is very specific. Recital 42 in GDPR says that when you use consent as your legal basis, then you also need to account for these things. And it has to be also very clear to the data subject that you're doing that. So when you're informing them, the operational part is, how do you make this information available to them? Like, at what point in time do you show them this information? So there are operational considerations behind these actual requirements that it asks you to do. So let's take a couple of examples. An example is an employer asks his employees to consent to monitoring at work. How many people, by show of hands, would say that that's OK and can use consent? The employer can use consent for that. Nobody? Just because the question was worded that way? All right, that's right. So it creates an imbalance of power inside of GDPR. So the employer has more power over the employee, and it's not freely given consent. There is a condition, the employee probably feels compelled to give that consent given he's employed by the employer, right? Now, does that mean that you cannot do that? You cannot monitor? Does it mean that? It does not. You can do it, but you might want to use a different kind of legal basis. What would you potentially use? I heard legitimate interest creep up from somewhere. Yeah, you might use legitimate interest. As an employer, I want to monitor the websites that are loaded on my network to make sure that our network is secure, the information is secure. That's a legitimate interest of the employer. So the employer might do that. But it cannot rely on consent from the employee for doing that stuff. So maybe another example. I consent to direct marketing by email, phone, and paper mail. Is that okay consent, or is that not okay consent? If I were to check a box and say, I consent to this. Is that okay? Yes, no? Yeah, it's kind of up for interpretation and grabs. I might argue, and this is just my opinion, Achint's opinion, that it's not unbundled. It's not granular enough. You, as a marketing person, might argue that, look, our purpose is direct marketing. So there's a difference between purpose, and there is a difference between the channel used for that purpose, so the topic and the channel. So you might argue otherwise. So a lot of these things, they're not clearly defined in GDPR, and they're up for grabs. So there may be a potential argument there, and you can use that argument. A couple of other things. So the bottom line is terminology really, really matters in GDPR. Consent is not a concept. It's not something that gets kind of casually brought in, yes or no. It's a very, very specific legal instrument within the GDPR context. And it triggers these real-world operational things that you have to do as an organization. So data portability, you have to allow people to do that if you rely on consent. Right to be forgotten, which means erasing people's data, deleting people's data, or the user interfaces that you now need to provide for people to be able to withdraw consent or give consent, or the record keeping that goes behind the scenes for you to maintain records of these consents. And also, if you're deleting data, then making sure that you can demonstrate that you're actually doing those things. So it's not a loose concept, and it triggers a number of these things that you have to do in the back end. So that's why it's kind of the least popular thing. And it almost always is. If I'm a marketer, I probably want to rely on legitimate interest first. I probably want to start even a step before that. You want to start by looking at what's called as records of processing, or this inventorying requirement inside of GDPR. You want to then determine if any of your business processes, if consent is the appropriate legal mechanism that gets utilized for those. And for those activities, you want to then look at all these operational requirements. So it's not that you just start with consent and you just automatically rely on consent. There's a number of preambles to where you would implement consent within your workflows and your business processes. So the question then becomes, OK, if these are the requirements, when do you need it? Do you need consent all the time? Is consent mandatory inside of GDPR? Every time I have read the GDPR text, and I've got the text in my hand here, kind of green-colored book, every time I read, it doesn't look like to me that consent is mandatory. GDPR gives me these other options. I have choices. I can use a different legal basis, don't have to use consent. The only time these consent requirements actually get triggered is when you use consent as your legal basis. So it doesn't look like that it is mandatory inside of GDPR. You have choices, a bunch of choices to use. There will be cases where consent is the only option you have, right? And those are things up for grabs, like what do you rely on, whether it makes sense or does not make sense. But you've got choices inside of GDPR. But it becomes really, really hard for organizations to grasp. When we work with organizations, the first kind of thought process is, let's just go to consent. Not always the case, right? And there are upcoming requirements, which I'll also touch on, the e-privacy directive going into an e-privacy regulation, where consent has a big role to play. So maybe organizations are also forward-thinking. Maybe they're safeguarding themselves for the future when you rely on consent. But from a GDPR standpoint, if you look at the text, it's not mandatory to be using consent. Now, there's another concept in GDPR consent or explicit consent. So every time I've read the text, I mean, GDPR says freely given, unambiguous, informed, unbundled. To me, that means it is explicit. So what's the difference? That's not how GDPR is defined, or actually there's ambiguity in the way it has defined explicit consent. There is no clear definition. So what it says, though, is that there are 3 specific use cases where you might want explicit consent from an individual. And these use cases are when you're processing special categories of data, which means you're processing data that falls under health or other kind of requirements, or if you've got automated decision-making that happens on that data set, or if you're transferring data to third countries. Those are the things where you want to get explicit consent from individuals. So is there a difference? And where would we look to find the difference? So a good resource is the Working Party 29 guidance on consent, and they have granular examples. And the way they define this is that they say the term explicit refers to the way consent is expressed by the data subjects. So the way somebody is giving you consent defines that it's explicit or it's not explicit. So again, it's an operational requirement, architectural thinking. What are the user interfaces if you have to rely on these kind of data sets? And also, this is the marketer's dilemma. Do I use consent or do I go to legitimate interest? Where do I start? So you want to start by that journey. Do your record keeping first. Figure out what are the processes that need to rely on consent. And you might want to argue that some things do rely on legitimate interest. Consent becomes very definitive. Once you give consent, or once you use consent and somebody declines, that's it. You're done. You can't process their data anymore. Just cannot. You can't even bundle and say, OK, I'm going to use consent, but then if somebody declines, I'll fall back to legitimate interest. You can't do that either. So you have to choose one of the legal bases that is appropriate. And while Recital 47 actually recognizes that you can do direct marketing based on legitimate interest, you really want to have a strong defensible argument. Does the data subject that you will send an email to really want to receive that from you? What's your argument behind that? So you want to be able to articulate and cannot fall back on other things. So practically, how do you demonstrate that you've got consent? It's got to be unbundled, active opt-in. Checkbox cannot be pre-checked. They have to be unchecked. So somebody has to actively check these things. It has to be granular. So you tell people exactly the information you capture from them. It has to be named, which means if you transfer data to third parties, you have to tell your data subjects who those third parties are. Now, GDPR also relies on categories. So you might do categories of third parties. So in the future, if you add new third parties, you don't have to go back and get reconsent. But you have to account for things like easy to withdraw. The best advice that I have gotten and heard is, if for you as a business, you think it's going to be hard to get consent from people, then probably it's not the best legal basis to rely on. So things like pre-checked boxes, inactivity, silence, they didn't reply for 2 weeks, which means they gave consent, that doesn't work. Active things like ticking a box, choosing a specific technical setting that is not turned on by default, or specific information that somebody fills out. Those are the actionable things that are required inside of GDPR. So regular consent, you might tick a box, submit button. People want to use preference centers. There's this concept of opting down versus opting out. That's the new thing inside of marketing. So you give people these matrix kind of preference centers where they can choose the frequency and the channel through which they want to get these things. Explicit consent requires things like two-stage verification, electronic signatures, et cetera, that could be utilized as a means. That's the guidance from Working Party 29 to do these things. So in your records, what do you show? You show who consented, when they consented, what they were told, and how they actually consented. Those are the things you need for your record-keeping requirements. So these are the things that you note down. Make sure you're providing them appropriate notice. Make sure you know the method and you know the records. So I'll just finish up with, there are rules coming on. e-privacy regulation. Consent is one of the only legal basis. It's highly lobbied. We'll see what happens with it. But there are other resources, like the Cantera initiative. It has like this concept of consent receipts. Highly interesting. Definitely invite you to check it out. And the DMA, I think they have a draft guidance on legal basis, consent versus legitimate interest, GDPR for marketers. So absolutely recommend checking that out. And then consent management tools, like managing the overall life cycle of this entire process. And the organization I represent, OneTrust, we actually have a tool where you might start with things like define a purpose of your business process, then define what are the different collection points where you get people's information: mobile, phone calls, paper forms, web forms. Take a piece of code and embed that into your web forms so it becomes integrated, and then utilize a preference center for individuals so they can choose their preferences and they can mark those down. And in the background, retain auditable records of each of these consents that you get, and ultimately integrate with tools like CRMs or marketing automation tools so they can utilize that information before they start blasting out these emails that might go to your users. And I'll just leave you with, we guys do a lot of work around this area, also host these workshops called Privacy Connect, highly, highly attended events. We've got these GDPR texts. It's just the text, very popular green-colored books. So if you're interested, you can find those at our booth. All right, thank you.